There may be other members of this chamber who are similarly situated to myself and the representative from Wyoming. And if so, I apologize for focusing on simply our two situations. But the representative from Wyoming and myself share a significant commonality, which is that we operate and have financial interest in restaurants which pay tipped wage and in which the workers tip. So I rise today, Mr. Speaker, in opposition to my own apparent self-interest to speak against this bill. And I do so, first of all, with a deep appreciation of my colleague from Wyoming and a deep appreciation for his heart and his deep and sincere concern for his workers. And I ask him, and I ask the rest of this chamber to consider that I think that we had the opportunity, and we still at this moment have the opportunity, to improve the situation for workers in our industry. And that a no vote today does not have to be the end of this discussion. It has to be a no on this proposal. And it would allow us to come back and have a robust conversation about about avoiding the deep damage that is proposed in this bill. And I want to speak precisely and at slightly more length than my colleague from Dearborn Heights about the implications of inflation. Because inflation and the concept of inflation lies at the heart of what is changing in this bill today. This bill essentially takes the accident of the fact that eventually you can get to a finish line, in this case $12 an hour, by doing something completely unrelated to providing workers with support, and says, look, we got to 12, that's the 12 equals 12, therefore it's kind of the same thing and it's kind of helping workers. Well, in fact, in a world with inflation, and let's stipulate for the purpose of this speech that inflation is 3%, which it approximately is. In a world of 3% inflation, if we do nothing, as my colleague pointed out moments ago, we will of course eventually hit a $12 an hour minimum wage. The amended bill as it stands proposes a sub-inflationary increase in the wage to achieve an eventual $12 an hour wage, which means that this bill as it stands would functionally propose a year after year after year erosion of the earning power of the people who work in this for minimum wage or for the tip minimum wage, and acts as though the smokescreen of increasing costs in our society can hide that real erosion to the dignity, to the economic dignity of the people who this bill will affect if it passes. The other point that's worth making here is that, and this is critical, we all heard my friend from Pontiac, our colleague from Pontiac, a few days ago stand up and talk about how one of the defining proud moments in his career was indexing our minimum wage to inflation. This bill as it stands stops that connection, which means whatever this bill did, even if it were to provide just increases until 2030, I think is when the process is supposed to end. At that point, we would then start that second layer of erosion of economic security for the people who this bill affects. So there are two falsehoods in this bill. The first is failing to acknowledge the reality of inflation in the way the bill is currently crafted. The second is to quietly fail to acknowledge it as a basic matter of justice as we move forward with the minimum wage. And I have a hard time believing that anyone in this chamber actually wants to not acknowledge the existence of inflation in our economy. And as a matter of fact, this is an important concept, and I'm sorry if I'm being slightly pedantic, but one of the nightmares that standard economists talk about is the possibility of deflation. That means that we have a number of institutions in our society which really try to make sure that we never go below the inflationary levels we've had in the last 2 or 3 or or even maybe the last decade. But those of us who are old enough to remember the 80s remember that there's a real possibility that inflation in a few years could be 5, 6, 7%, in which case the insult done by the insult and injury done by this bill would be massively more than I think many of us would anticipate, because we tend to think that things will go on in the future. Well, I personally don't think that I've been given a personal guarantee that inflation will always stay at 3%. In fact, I think there's a very good chance that somewhere between now and 2030, inflation is going to vastly exceed 3%. So locking workers into a non-inflation indexed series of wage steps forces them into a huge bet that inflation will always stay low, which I think is a very dubious assumption. And I'm sorry that that was slightly pedantic, but it's important for us all to understand the fire we're playing with this legislation. I want to take a moment, Mr. Speaker, to lament the fact that there were possibilities between leaving the legislation as enacted and actually eroding the economic power of the people that this bill is going to affect. And I want to suggest one obvious thing that we could have done, which would have addressed my colleagues from Wyoming's concerns entirely. If we had instituted a mechanism which allowed 50% of a worker's tips to count towards the minimum wage gap, then tipped workers who were earning a high level of tips would have continued to earn that high level of tips, and employers would not have borne any additional payroll cost. If we had said instead of 100% of people's tips going to make up the delta between the tip minimum wage and the minimum wage, my colleague from Wyoming's workers wouldn't have been affected at all, but it would have raised the fortunes of people making low levels of tips. And those people are real. And they're not in my restaurant, as far as I know, as far as I can tell from looking at our books. And I believe that they're not in my colleague from Wyoming's restaurant, and I'm glad for that. But they're real and they exist in the economy. Not every tipped worker in this state is fortunate enough to make $20 an hour. Not every worker can go, certainly not every worker can go home and assume that they will make that level next week. So there were other things that we could have done to land somewhere in the middle. And I like to think that this body can and is capable of reasoning together. But I've seen no evidence of it in the process that brought us thus far with this bill. And so I'd implore my colleagues to vote no on this, not as a rejection of any possibility of further thought on this issue, but as a rejection of eroding the rights and the economic power of the people in the state of Michigan who will be affected by this legislation. And the last thing I want to point out, Mr. Speaker, is that there is very good evidence that as a practice, wage theft is happening, particularly in the tipped wage workplace. And that wage theft can often take the form of death by 1,000 cuts. So if an employee is making the minimum tip wage, which is about $3 an hour, and they make within $1 of the minimum wage, imagine what they're then faced with. They're faced with the burden of going to their employer after, say, working 20 hours in a week and saying, you owe me $13.23 or whatever random amount. Now, that assumes then that the worker is going to, that the cost of going and talking to their employer and confronting their employer and not getting paid that wage that they're duly owed is worth the benefit to them. And I would submit to you that that's exactly where wage theft happens, where the price of confrontation is greater than the value of the wage that's being claimed. And I would like at this point, Mr. Speaker, and I recognize that you may gavel me down on this, but I want to at least express my hope that you, as our next speaker, and our next governor and our next attorney general will work on the issue of wage theft.
I do, Representative, have to ask you to keep your comments tailored to the merits of this bill, and I think I've provided very broad permission in speaking to the process thus far, so I'm going to ask that you refine your comments here on out. Chair recognizes Representative LaGrand.
I appreciate it, Mr. Speaker, and I know you're actually very diligent at trying to hold that line, and that's why I flagged it for you. I know I might have been speaking long enough that you fell asleep, so I wanted to make sure that you noticed that there was a judgment call there. Colleagues, I think we can do better. I think that we can do more for justice. I think that we can do more for our fellow brothers and sisters in this state who aren't fortunate enough to earn the wage that we earn by being here working for them. But we are here to work for them. We are not here to work for ourselves. I am not here to work for my restaurant. I am not here to work for an industry that I am part of. I am here to work for the people of the state of Michigan, and particularly the people of the state of Michigan who do not have a voice through lobbyists as effectively as other groups because they don't have the financial leverage. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I would hope that we would consider thoughtfully, all of us, the simple question of whether we can do better than a yes vote would represent here today. Thank you.